Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Grace Covenant Chats, brought to you by Grace Covenant Church here in Philadelphia. I am your host, Caleb Watt, here with maybe my slightly less patient or a little bit impatient co-host now, but still the man of the hour.
I'm patient. It just it feels like a glitch in the matrix right now.
It's a glitch in the matrix because our recording did not go the way that we thought it was going to be. So it was a spicy morning, Peter.
Spicy, yeah.
Spicy.
Black pepper level spice.
Black pepper level spice. Salt and pepper really give it a kick. You don't understand them. Anyways, continuing on. We're talking about money today. Pastor Doug, what are we talking about with regards to money?
So Caleb, we really sped through that, We didn't want that matrix glitch to last too long.
Yeah.
But anyway, so on Sundays we've been talking about stewardship. Stewardship being the act of managing what does not really belong to us. And in many ways, the most basic thing that we manage is our money, because money is something that we all have to deal with. It's a reality in the world. We can't escape it unless we move to a desert and somehow live a self-sustaining or the wilderness or whatever, right? And somehow live a self-sustaining life. But the truth is, we're probably not allowed to do that, right? God calls us in the community and to be salt and light in this world, meaning we have to be in the world. And that means we have to interact with money. And so we can't escape it. And so how then can we have good wisdom in how we manage it? Because I think God wants us to manage our money well, knowing that it's actually not ours, it's His. And so the stewardship series has been looking at that. How do we manage our money in a God-honoring and a wise way? And so, but though, that lends to the question of, is money evil though? Is money something that we should try not to think about too much because it's wrong, right? And the truth is, money is an area that brings a lot of shame, right? A lot of people don't like talking about their finances with other people because of the feeling of shame. A lot of people don't want to talk about how much they make, right? Or because it leads to comparison and things like that. People don't want to talk about how much money they have saved in the bank and all that kind of stuff, right? It's an area that brings a lot of shame, a lot of fear, and then that makes us feel really alone. And my hope is that we can sort of bring that out to the light because we want to bear one another's burdens, and that includes the area of our finances, our money as well. We want to be able to share even when we're struggling, because otherwise it'll be a burden that becomes really heavy on our lives. And so I want to talk about, is money evil? Is money something that we should try to avoid talking about?
Right, because the verse that comes to mind, right, and I think that you probably had in mind when you were thinking about this episode too, right? Oh, do you have it pulled up?
I have it pulled up.
Oh, shoot.
I am an Eagle Scout, and the Boy Scout motto is be prepared.
Be prepared. You are very prepared. But it's a verse in 1 Timothy, right? First Timothy 6?
6, you're right.
Right.
In 6:10, it says, "For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs." But that verse, the first part is really what many people know. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. And through time and culture, that's sort of gotten watered down to money is the root of all evil. And, that made many Christians feel money is wrong. I don't want to think about money. Don't talk about money. Just make it. I have to use it, but I don't want to think about it more than I have to. Is that right, though? Is money evil?
That's interesting because I think there's I'm no seminarian, I'm no whatever, but I know that in the New Testament, one of the words used for money is mammon or whatever, right? And I've heard that it frequently has negative connotations associated with that, right? So I guess it is a very pertinent question, right? Even societally, right? Is money a good thing or bad thing? Right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah. How do you view it, Peter?
Well, you bring up an interesting point about the mammon issue, because that's how Jesus sometimes refers to money in the Gospels. But he often uses it when he's talking about serving God or money. It's who are you serving? Because mammon, it was sort of a phrase to talk about almost like a deified version, right, of money. I wish I knew a little bit more. I should have been prepared. No, you're going to bring that up, Caleb, but it's okay. It's okay. We're good.
Not
we're
ready.
ready. But I think Jesus is actually trying to show that, you can't serve. It's if you serve it, it's like a god to you. It's like idolatry, right? He says you cannot serve both God and money. He's not saying you can't use money. He's saying you can't serve it. You can't orient your life to where you can't make your life all about it.
Hmm.
And so that's why I think he uses that word to show that it's like basically it's like a god, it's like an idol.
Hmm.
Don't do that, right?
Hmm.
But he's not saying do away with money.
Hmm.
He even says render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? And he uses like a coin to talk about that, right? There's a use of money, and Jesus himself was bankrolled by rich followers, right? There's a little verse in Luke that talks about how that he had these rich women who were supporting his ministry, right? Jesus needed money to do what he was doing. It's not super cheap to be able to travel around from town to town to support himself, support like his followers and things like that. He needed to be bankrolled by some rich followers who were supporting him. And so Jesus himself didn't, had to use money. He couldn't take himself away from it. But it's about like the orientation of the heart. What are you serving? Right. That's why he uses that word mammon. Yeah.
And so that's how you view the verse in First Timothy as well.
Sort of in that way, right? Is that what you? I mean, it's not using the word mammon, but the way the verse is actually written, right? It doesn't say money is the root of all evil. It says for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. Like two things I'll notice. One, it says the love of money, meaning the pursuit, the orientation of your life, the making it of an idol of a god, right? You cannot serve both God and money. That is what is a root of all kinds of evils. And the second thing is it says a root of all kinds of evils, not the root, right? Many people will say money is the root, but even the love of money isn't the root of all kinds of, it's a root. There's many roots of evils, right? Money is not the worst possible thing that is out there. And to make money this thinking that's like the most evil thing, like that will cause us then to feel a level of shame when we think about it, right? Because sometimes a Christian might think, hey, I'm concerned about my money. That means I'm a bad Christian. I shouldn't be concerned about money. No, it's perfectly fine to be concerned about money because we need to be able to support ourselves, support our families. And so we should be thinking about it. It's not wrong to think about money. It's not wrong to be concerned about it. But what's the pursuit of your life, right? What is what is your source of comfort and security? Is it money or is it God? Jesus says you cannot serve both God and money.
Right. Is it in that same passage where he talks about worrying? Right.
Yeah.
Or I forget. I remember it's in the
Matthew
same chapter.
Matthew 6. Yeah.
But I forget if it was like
Matthew 6.
tied.
It's also like do not lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. He talks about like don't worry about what you'll eat, what you'll wear. The Lord knows we need those things.
Yeah, but I feel like along the lines of that, right? It's kind of like what you're saying, right? It's almost like, oh, Jesus is telling me not to worry, so why should I think about money, right? Like, yeah, like how do you see that like play out? Where there's like, again, I think Proverbs presents a pretty strong case for being like wise with how you spend your money and do what you're doing. But then here's Jesus saying, hey, don't worry. It almost comes across, at least to me as a 21st century reader, right? It almost comes across as like, hey, just don't worry about it. Like, don't deal with it, right? I'll deal with it, and stuff like that. So how do you see the two?
Well, to be clear, listen to the Sermon on the Mount. And if you remember the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus only said a few verses prior to that, like, if your hand calls you to sin, cut it off, right? So I think there's a level of hyperbole, right, that Jesus is using in the Sermon on the Mount because he's presenting a picture of what kingdom life is supposed to be like. So it's the ideal, right? In the ideal world, we're living in a kingdom where we don't have to worry about money because we're living in true abundance with one another, with our surroundings, with the world, right? When God placed Adam and Eve in the garden, they were living in abundance, right? They had all the trees, all the plants to take as food, right? Except for the one, but everyone's like, oh, that one, God, you're such a miser, yet you give everything else, right? He literally gave everything else, right? I talked about that in one of our Sunday messages, right? We can either focus on the fact that God gave everything except a tree or think, how could you not give that tree? But, God created us to live in abundance under his care and provision and under the care of others as well, like in community. That's the ideal. And Jesus, in showing the kingdom, that's the ideal, right? The kingdom of God is meant to be a place where we live in the abundance of our Father and the abundance of being together with others. But obviously, we also live in a broken world. We live in an already, but not yet. And so there is a level of fear and worry that we can have, but I think Jesus hinting at, does it consume you, right? If the worry consumes you, that shows that you don't truly trust your Father in heaven. It means that you feel like you need to trust yourself. You need to place matters in your own hands. But that doesn't mean we can't worry. We're always going to have worry, right? I worry a lot. I'm an anxious person. I get nervous about things, and that's perfectly normal. But we want to make sure we bring those to the Lord and dissect them, understand them. But we shouldn't like make ourselves feel bad that we worry. Like, oh, I can't believe I worry. That means I'm such a bad Christian. No, every person has some level of worry. And again, Jesus is being hyperbolic about this.
Right. There's a degree of intentionality that comes with it too. Right?
Yeah. And sometimes we need a little bit of worry to push ourselves, right? You know?
Right. Yeah. So then what do you feel is like the purpose of money, right? Biblically? Well, I guess I just remembered I'm talking to a former finance bro.
Whoa. I never worked in finance, nor was finance my concentration.
Sure,
I mean, yes, I went to Wharton undergrad, studied business.
That's
but not finance. I studied, well, I mean, everyone has to take finance, but my concentration was accounting, and I worked in consulting. So not a finance bro, but
r/finance on Reddit.
I may follow that sub, but it's okay. I like economics and finance.
Okay.
As I joke, you can take the boy out of Wharton, but you can't take the Wharton out of the boy.
Wait, that's kind of true.
Yeah.
Wait, that's so true. Okay, never mind. I'm glad I didn't apply to Wharton.
Hashtag deep. Anyway, money serves a purpose because it balances, society, right? Trading is necessary in any society because some people have some things, some people have others, right? And how are you going to be able to spread out the goods that different people have access to so that all people have access to various goods? You need to trade, right? Back in the olden days, right? You would trade, you would have some level of bartering, right? You would kind of like talk it out, like I have a pound of salt. I want to buy some wool from you. Like, what's the agreement? So you talk it out, hash it out. But that becomes complicated, it becomes tedious, and sometimes it can lead to people being disadvantaged on one side or the other. Like the person who might be more in need will be willing to, take a worse deal because they really need that. Money balances that because now you have a uniform way of valuing things. That becomes an even playing field to be able to sell your goods on a market. And trusting that like supply and demand will keep things in check. Obviously, there's always inefficiencies, and there's still always going to be greed and people taking advantage of the system. There's sin in the world, but the reason money was created because it was meant to be a way of balancing the marketplace to put people on a level playing field, right? Have something that is like an agreed upon value, right? And money used to always be tied to something, right? Money used to always be tied to like gold or silver or something. It wasn't until like more recent history where money wasn't really tied to anything, and money printer go burr.
So many memes.
yeah. But anyway, yeah, like that's a whole other issue and thing, long digression that we don't need to get into. But at its base level, money is a thing that balances society and allows people to trade without having fears of having to like figure out what is like a pound of salt worth in terms of like your wool or in terms of like, your grain or whatever, right? You have money to determine your value.
So how do you, I guess in alignment with that, like how do you feel like the Bible then presents like a picture of money?
Yeah.
Right. Like I feel like my next question is almost like, well, my mind goes to two places. One is a lot of people try to use the Bible to defend both capitalism and socialism, right?
Yeah.
And
just say that I think the Bible doesn't care about our isms, so it's like a silly debate to have, regardless. So
yeah, I agree, but it's also like the Bible sometimes seems to have. I think to me it highlights that sometimes maybe there's confusing things about money, right, or like value, as you're saying, right, in the Bible, and then it leads me to my second point. It's almost like, is heaven gonna have currency? Right? Like, I don't know if that's but maybe that's like the extreme of like
that wasn't in the show notes, Caleb.
But like the idea that like is if the Bible being consistent, like God, the way that God sees money, right? Is money? Oh, maybe this is where the question is going for me. Is money just a byproduct of a sinful world that God is using, or is it like part of the design?
Yeah.
Right. That to me, I think strikes a little bit more like the question, what is the purpose of money?
Yeah.
Right. Too. So.
Well, the first question had to do with like, what is the Bible like? Sort of, what is its relation to money? Right.
Yeah.
I would say the Bible kind of sees money just as a fact of life. Right.
Okay.
Proverbs talks about it as if it's just there, right? It's just something we have to relate to. Jesus talks about it as if it's just something that's there, right? Even here in First Timothy, right? I only read one verse, but there's a whole like section here about money. It's just sort of a fact of life. And the issue they're really contending with is, how do you not let it control your life? How do you not allow it to become like an idol in your life? How do you manage it well, not be wasteful, and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think the Bible just sees it as like a fact of life. It doesn't try to assign like a morality to money as a concept in itself. It assigns morality to chasing money, to making it idol. But I think it just sort of says money is just a reality of life. But let's make sure that we relate to it in a wise way. Now, will there be like money in heaven? I don't know, right? Like, who knows? Like, I think there will be some level of like trading. There will be some level of like commerce of some sort, right? But the truth is, like, we'll be living in abundance. And so I'm not sure, like, they'll necessarily I don't know if we'll have like wealth. Like, we won't store necessarily. I don't think unless they store our own wealth in the same sort of way. But who knows, right? God doesn't give us, the Bible doesn't give us like a clear picture of that or not. I think it's pretty clear that there will be some level of like work that we're doing. But I think because of the absence of sin, there's an ability to be sharing and willing to like care for one another without the need to have like money as like a balancing act, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Adam Smith, right, kind of says that like, capitalism only works because of like the inherent self-interest that we have. But in heaven, there won't be inherent self-interest because it will actually be God-centered and other-centered, right? And so, in many ways, maybe like economic system won't really need economic system because we'll be inherently other interested. And that means we give freely and we also live in abundance. But this is all conjecture. Who knows, right?
For sure. I like that thought. Yeah. So then I guess that leads to the next part of the show notes, right? Is how do we use money, right? How do we? I think to me, I like reading your comment, even some of what we talked about previously, off the podcast. What it reminded me of was
exclusive content.
Exclusive content. Yeah. Once you start working for GCC,
join our Patreon.
Join our Patreon, Ram, for more.
Our private Discord.
Private Discord. Yeah, members only. But there's like, I feel like the Bible has a very strong calling for us to be generous, right? Like Paul in 2 Corinthians 8 is like, be generous as like the grace that was like shown to you. Is he saying to like rich people? I think I remember correctly, right? And if we understood grace, that's a lot, right? That like to match that level of generosity is impossible, right? But then there's also, again, maybe I'm getting into dicey territory here because it's Ecclesiastes, right? Where one of the main things that the teacher seems to say is like, one of the few good things in life is just enjoying the fruit of your labor, right? And he says that a few times. So like, what's the balance there?
Yeah.
Right. What's the balance?
It's a good question.
Between,
and Ecclesiastes gets interpretationally confusing.
That's what I'm saying is dicey. Right?
You don't always know what to accept as like what he actually wants you to believe or what he's just sort of saying as a concession.
Sure.
Because at the end he does say like, we're all gonna die anyway, so like it's all fruitless, but love God, right? So anyway, but actually something similar is said here in 1 Timothy. Let me make sure I can actually find it. It says in verse 6:17, it says, "As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy." So we can enjoy, right? We just have to recognize where our money comes from ultimately. It comes from God, right? And even says here, set their hopes on what? The uncertainty of riches, right? Even if we think, I work for my money, but like you could lose your job any moment, right? Like really, we don't have much control over our lives. But what we do have, we can trust is from God, and He says He gives it for us to enjoy. And so it's not wrong to like enjoy the money we have and to use it for our own good. But it's wrong if that's our only pursuit, if we're not being generous, if we're not stretching ourselves in generosity. So like there is a balancing act right there. We should make sure we are being generous. We should have money set aside in our budget. Like first line item, as people would say, your first line item should be your generosity on your budget before you put like your utilities or your rent or anything else. Say, this is how much I want to give. And you should decide in your heart how much you want to give. Paul talks about that in 2 Corinthians as well, like decide in your heart. But make that the first and foremost thing and make that an untouchable. Like, if things get shaky in your budget, maybe check out the other stuff before you work. Generosity is just something I think that we should be fighting to, protect in all seasons, whether we're in, going through seasons of plenty or a season of poverty. We want to seek to be generous. Jesus even commended the widow who gave 2 pennies. He says she gave out of her poverty.
Hmm.
and he commends her for that versus those who gave out of their wealth.
Hmm.
And so in any season, fight to keep generosity at the top line of our budget.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean we can't have other things to enjoy. We're allowed to enjoy, but decide in your heart first, generosity, and from there we should work down into our budget, not the other way around. Oh, this is what I want to spend. Blah 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 blah. All right, I guess this is all I have left. That's what we give. No, flip it around. This is This is how I feel God is calling me generous. Now I will choose. Now I'll choose to live off the rest and make that work.
What do you feel like? What do you feel like is a good spot to start for practicing generosity? Right. And I ask this question knowing that maybe the most cliche common answer is like tithe 10%, right? But like, I mean, like for some people, maybe that feels very high, right? Or like even impossible to start at. So do you feel like it's okay to start like lower? And then do you feel like 10% maybe isn't all that generous sometimes, right? Like for lack of a better expression, right? Like how do you feel like, growing in generosity?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about this in a future message, but the tithe was actually always just the one portion of like the giving that was required in the Old Testament. Obviously, we're not bound by the Old Testament's like regulations in that sense. But people say, oh, the tithe, but they had the tithe and then they had like other offerings on top of that. Like they had their free will offerings, they had their, guilt offerings, all these other stuff that they give on top of the tithe that would also like involve giving of their wealth. I remember a professor I had who like tried to figure out a percentage that like your average like Jewish person in the Old Testament would have given after all those different things, and it came out to more like 25% or something.
Wow. Okay.
Because he mentioned like, the tithe was one part of the giving, but it wasn't the only thing they gave.
Right. Tithe was to support the Levites, right?
Generally, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's one part of scripture says Levites, another part says Levites, and like the needy in your camp. But,
okay.
But I think at its base level, it's easy. It's best. It was supposed to support like the worship of the of the community, right? The Levites and all that went into the worship, the worship. So yeah, and that's why people often talk about that funneling then to like giving to the church, because it's sort of the covenantal synonyms, I guess, between the old and the new covenant. But anyway, so tithe, I think is a good like just base level to start. But if you really feel anxious and can't do that, then it's okay to start smaller. Because again, we're not necessarily bound by Old Testament regulation, right? There's no law, but we're called to be generous. And even Jesus even says like, your righteousness should exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, who gave very much according to every rule and regulation. They gave, they tithe everything, like, right? It says like every, what's the word? He's like every like their spice and mints and whatever, right? And so, he said, but your righteousness should exceed them. So they were pretty good about giving of their tithes, if he's saying your righteousness should exceed that. So we should be stretching ourselves in generosity. But it has to grow. And so if we can't do it, if we really just feel like we can't do it, we feel really anxious, just start somewhere. But ultimately we're called to grow in a generosity. And for those who are giving the tithe already, if you've been doing that for a while, maybe God is calling you to stretch that, to grow a little bit. I remember hearing one pastor said that every year they try to give 1% more, knowing that God was calling them to grow their generosity year by year. And I think doing something like that is good, right? Stretching yourself in your generosity. But start somewhere and start intentionally, but grow from there.
I like that, P-Dog. Do you have any concluding thoughts for us today on the topic of money?
Well, I think, again, just to clear up, money is not something I think we should think of as inherently evil or shameful. It's something that we need to bring out into the light. We talk about. Jesus talked about it plenty. Money was one of the most common things he talked about. He even stared at people as they were giving money into the offering box, right? That's how he knew the widow gave. That's how he knew other people. He was watching them. So sometimes people like want to like be really hiding and nervous about how much they give and that. But no, I feel like this is something we should be willing to like talk about, bring into the light about our finances. Because again, we want to support one another, we want to bear one another's burdens. Otherwise, we're going to get buried under the weight of our own shame, our own guilt. But God doesn't want that. God wants us to find freedom from the things that hold us back. And I think part of that is being willing to talk about money and recognizing that it's not inherently evil. But it's something that we all have to interact with. And so how can we support one another in this?
I like that. It's interesting because talking about money always reminds me about something my 7th grade history teacher said, because he would say every day, and that's the only lesson that he wanted to teach us, which is that times change, but people don't. and I think talking about money is like, clearly people were very concerned about money in Jesus' day. people were very concerned about money, right? Like 300 years ago, and people are still very concerned about money to this day. So very relevant topic, Peter.
Always relevant, yeah.
Always relevant. But you have been listening to Grace Coming to Chats here, brought to you by Grace Coming to Church in Philadelphia. You can go check us out at philly.gracecoming.net. Wow, I almost like slurred some words together. If you're new here, and join us on Sundays at Meyerson for our series on stewardship to hear more messages about stewardship like this one. And we will see you next time.